morning, everyone, or good afternoon if you're joining us from other parts of the world. My name's Alexis Tyndall. I'm the Manager of Digital Stewardship here at the University of Adelaide Library. I'd like to say thank you very much for joining us for today's Digital Humanities Lab webinar. This is the third of 5 sessions that we're offering during 2022. Before we start, I live and work on the lands of the Kaurna people, and I would very much like to acknowledge and pay my respects to them as the traditional custodians whose ancestral lands I'm joining you from today. I acknowledge the deep feelings of attachment and relationship of the Kaurna people to country, and we respect and value their past, present and ongoing connection to the land and cultural beliefs. As this webinar is online, and I understand quite a few people are coming from other parts of Australia and the world, it's possible you're joining us from other places. So I extend that respect to relevant communities in other regions, and especially any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us today. With this DH Lab webinar series, the University Library hopes to inspire and inform humanities researchers and their potential collaborators who are interested in using digital approaches in their work. Potential collaborators can include everything from researchers from other disciplines, representatives of the GLAM sector or galleries, libraries, archives and museum sector, students and basically whoever else is interested. Everyone is welcome at these sessions and your contribution is greatly appreciated. These webinars are showcasing real projects and real researchers that are using data, digital tools or digital research methods to drive, enrich, complement or communicate their research. Before we start, I've just got a couple of little bits of housekeeping to take care of. Today's session will be recorded and shared after the event on the University of Adelaide YouTube page. As attendees, your faces won't be seen on screen, but your questions may be answered and acknowledged if you ask them in the chat window. We will have both of our presenters first today and then bring them back for questions and discussion at the end. If you have any questions during their presentations, please look to the bottom of your screen to find the chat icon and ask your questions in the chat window. They can be sent through at any time, and I will pose those questions to the speakers when they both rejoin us at the end of the session. We've got a couple of really interesting presenters today who have diverse experiences with gaming, virtual reality and immersive environments. Technology is enabling new kinds of cultural and leisure experiences, and researchers are exploring the ways in which people respond to these environments and the ways that we can use these environments in new ways. It's also worth thinking critically about how they've been used to date and the consequences of the way things are designed. So first up, we have Tamika Glouftsis, who is a PhD candidate from the Department of History here at the University of Adelaide. Her research focuses on the use of video games to promote historical thinking outside of the academy, with a special focus on challenging, traumatic and contested histories. She's deeply passionate about history education, especially the use of new media and technology to disseminate academic research to a broad audience. Tamika is also a community lead and designer for Dream of Darkness, an upcoming Aztec cosmic horror game that is adapting new historical findings and a diversity of perspectives from research on the Spanish colonization of Mexico. And with that, I'll turn my camera and microphone up and pass over to Tamika. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for the kind introduction. As Alexis said, I am Tamika. I am a PhD candidate in history here at the Uni of Adelaide, but I'm also part-time working for a video game company, an indie company based in Mexico City. And we're creating a game called Dream of Darkness, which is a Aztec cosmic horror 3D adventure, which I will get into very shortly. So what I want to talk about today is firstly a little bit about my own research and what I've been discovering during my PhD, and then how that led me into working for a indie game company, how that led me to Dream of Darkness, and how some of my research is sort of being implemented into that game and how we're using it in praxis, which is really exciting. Okay, fantastic. I will just give a quick little outline of what we'll be doing. So firstly, I'm going to talk a little bit about historical game studies, what's going on in the field. I talk a little bit about my own research. So a couple key themes that I'll pull out are empathy and perspective taking, and the way that games can communicate multiple perspectives in history. Then I'll get into Dream of Darkness, talk a little bit about our framework for historically meaningful game design, talk about the historical arguments and sort of procedural rhetoric that we're implementing into the game, and close off with some final thoughts. Also, I just want to point out that at the bottom, I've got the social handles. So you can find me on Twitter, and I'm also, committed to public engagement with history in every way. So I've been using TikTok as well, which is honestly a very underrated platform. Highly recommend you get onto it. Also, you can find the Dream of Darkness updates on TikTok and Twitter and our website down the bottom there. So enough of the self-promo. Now I'll get onto the actual presentation. So historical game studies is an absolutely popping field to be in. It's really exploded over the past 10 years or so. It's so fun. It's so much new and exciting activity going on. So it's really blossomed. It's very exciting. And fortunately, as a field, we've sort of moved on from the question of can games be history? And it's been pretty well established that games can convey historical arguments. Even commercial games that are made for entertainment convey historical arguments. And there's been a number of really excellent theoretical frameworks talking about what kind of history that we can get in games. So Jeremiah McCall's historical problem space is one that I draw on a lot in my work. Also, Adam Chapman's landmark book, Digital Games as History in 2016, was the first really comprehensive attempt to map historical epistemologies onto game genres and talk about the natural affinities between different types of gameplay and different types of history, which is very cool. And a lot of games have been analysed for their critical and subversive historical arguments. So Spec Ops: The Line, the pictured one there, is one that's been talked about a lot for the way that it conveys this critical view of the American War on Terror. But the unique relationship between interactivity and historical thinking still remains quite understudied, especially in practice and outside of a classroom or a museum or an institutional context. So what I'm really interested in is mass public consumption of media outside of these structured learning environments and what sort of history they can be useful for. So that's led me to a few key research questions. Firstly, how can video games foster critical historical thinking in a broad public audience? And what are the opportunities and the limitations for video games as a form of communicating scholarly historical arguments? Now, I'll just pick out a few key themes that I've studied because they will relate to Dream of Darkness, which I'll talk about shortly. So firstly, a big one is empathy. And if you're familiar at all with fields of virtual reality or augmented and mixed reality, you'll probably hear people talking about empathy. It's one of the most sort of seductive and fascinating possibilities of the medium. Now, historical empathy is something that has been studied a lot in sort of historical pedagogy and philosophy of history and how we as historians approach the past. So one way of describing it is that empathy is a necessary condition for historical understanding to see how a course of action was reasonable in its own terms. The critical thinking framework developed by Peter Sykes calls this perspective taking, but I argue that it is more than just perspective taking, and that's because the fields of psychology, social sciences that have researched empathy have found that empathy is something that requires both an affective, so an emotional, and a cognitive component. So empathy works on both of these domains. So a really great working definition of historical empathy is that it is a dual domain construct where the thoughts and the acts of the historical actor connected with his or her affective situation are the targets of examination. So you can't just have emotion and you can't just have pure cognition. It is a combination of both to fully understand a historical actor's position and perspective. So one way we can define this is that affect and cognition, plus a recognition of the distance between the self and the other, so the sort of past as a foreign country idea, is what is required for historical empathy to occur, which leads us to historical understanding. Now, video games, fortunately, have some really unique traits which make them kind of ideal for triggering this sort of historical empathy. So games can be highly emotionally immersive. This is largely due to their interactivity. So because the player has a meaningful agency in the game space and the game dynamically responds to the user action, we're very connected to what's going on, and that involves us emotionally and effectively. Some people do worry about over-immersion and over-emotional affect, which is definitely a concern. But games can also distantiate us and they can activate our cognition. So the formal features of video games can highlight the mediated nature of the experience. So we're not seeing the past as it really was. We are playing it in a game. And there are all of these mediating features going on to show us that we're engaging in a representation. And the interactive nature of games that requires challenge, thinking through problems, puzzles, they also require critical thinking. So a way that we can think about empathy in video games is that we have affective immersion through interactivity and cognition through challenge. Combine that with distanciation through the foregrounding of the mediated nature of the experience, and that can lead us to historical empathy in turn. Now, a lot of this has been about taking the perspective of people in the past. And one of the most powerful things about games that I found in my research is the way that they can communicate multi-perspectivity and really get into these multivalent, flexible, multiplicitous forms of historical thinking. So some features of digital games is that their simultaneity, multivalency, and flexibility. The really cool thing about digital works is that multiple narratives do not have to resolve themselves into a single authoritative or master account or master narrative. So it's kind of postmodern in that way. We can have multiple truths in games. We can have multiple narratives, multiple perspectives. And because of the nature of games, you can play one storyline, another one, and another one, and they all sort of exist in the digital space at the same time, and a huge amount of data can be communicated to the player all at once. You don't ever have to have a one true ending or a one true argument or a one true answer. They can all exist at the same time, which is really useful for historical thinking. So audiences can broaden their understanding of historical truth and knowledge. They can interact with multiple perspectives. So this is going to lead me now to talking a little bit about what we're doing with Dream of Darkness. So how did I, an Australian PhD student, end up working with this Mexican team? Well, they were basically looking for a historical game studies academic who was really passionate about communicating scholarly history to the public and bridging that gap between academic and popular histories. And so that's why I signed on to the team. And so I'm really working in that avenue of the game. How do we adapt academic histories into this game and then communicate them to the public in our social media, in our marketing, and in the game itself? So we're creating this immersive 3D adventure game that integrates cosmic horror themes in the setting of the Spanish conquest of Mexico in the 16th century. And some of the key aims of our game is that we're aiming to break down colonialist myths through showcasing diverse perspectives, perspectives that are often suppressed or ignored, based on the most up-to-date findings by historians. So we're hoping to bring together a lot of ethnographic research done in academic fields and adapt that into a sort of mass popular entertainment form. And one of the main texts that we're drawing on is Matthew Restall's 7 Myths of the Spanish Conquest. So you can see the myths up here on the screen now. These are all some of the key themes of the game that we are making sure that all of our gameplay, all of our design, characters, narrative, mechanics, etc., relate to these themes, and ensuring that we are adapting this sort of more recent and more deeply researched historical discourse instead of relying on cliches and stereotypes. Now, one of the biggest myths that I'm so excited that we're covering in this game is Malintzin, or La Malinche, or Donna Marina. You may have heard of her. So she was Cortez's interpreter. Without getting too much into the background of her, because she's a very complex and super fascinating figure, Malintzin was a slave girl who ended up becoming Cortez's primary interpreter and translator throughout the conquest. So she was essential to communication between the indigenous populations and the Spanish. She also played a huge role in negotiations, diplomacy, et cetera, et cetera. In Mexican popular culture, she tends to be imagined as a traitor and a seductress, and sort of like Mexico's original sin, betraying her own people. But her real story is a lot more complex than that. And there are a lot of different interpretations of who she is, who she was, and what she meant, and why she did the things that she did. We've made this little graphic here, which is on our website, which is sort of highlighting some of the different ways that Marina has been interpreted: victim, heroine, traitor, survivor. And by talking about this in our game and by showing Malincin's story, we're really hoping to broaden the public's understanding of who she was, interrogating the myths, and also interrogating who she was as a real person, and hoping to understand why she did the things that she did. We're really not trying to impose one authoritative account or interpretation of her. We definitely want to leave it up to the player to sort of play with her narrative themselves and make up their mind about who she was, or perhaps just interrogate some different ideas about who she was. And in that way, we're hoping to privilege, well, her own voice is sadly missing from the historical record, but privileging a diversity of voices about her rather than the traditional Spanish Catholic account of who she was. And that, of course, ties into the empathy and multi-perspectivity that we were talking about before. Showing different perspectives on the Spanish conquest is a huge part of what we're doing. And we're also hoping to let players sort of see the world through her eyes in a way that also acknowledges that we cannot fully understand her and who she was, and hopefully gain some deep historical understanding that way. Now, it's quite challenging to adapt history into a game. And through this process, I've really learned why people don't do it that much, not in this way that we're doing it, where historians are involved from the beginning, rather than just fact-checking things at the end. So game development needs to happen fast, but historical research needs to happen quite slowly. And this sort of mismatch in timeline can cause problems for the development process. Delays need to be avoided at all costs when making a game, because delays can cost you a huge amount of money. They can send the project into dangerous territory. If things don't get done, there's a chance the project never comes to fruition at all. So delays really need to be avoided. But historical research does take time, especially when you're a small, sort of underfunded indie team like we are. We don't have a huge amount of resources. We can't hire a full-time historian just to work for us at this point. Hopefully we can one day. So we need to always make compromises. There's been issues where, the game development team need to build something. They're building like a landmark, and they need to know what this particular feature look like. And the historians are like, oh, well, we don't know. It's going to take us 2 weeks to find out. And, it gets complicated. And there's always compromises between the needs of storytelling, drama, commercial needs, gameplay, and the historical record. So a big issue we face is how we ensure that our gameplay affordances, so what we're letting the player do in the game, are actually compatible with what is historically plausible, while still offering potential for fun, for fantasy, for experimentation and creativity. And the solution that we've sort of come to so far as a team, it's always in progress, is this concept and framework which we've developed that I call historically meaningful game design. So we actually sat down as a team together, and we created this document, we created this framework to help us guide decisions, historically important decisions for our game process. So I'll show you some quick screenshots from that. I'll just sort of breeze through. These are screenshots from our internal document that we wrote. So this is actually what our team uses when we need to solve a historical problem. Firstly, we've established what our key historical discourses are. So we need to know what arguments are we trying to privilege in our game. So you see we have a few here showing Marina's humanity, making a broader argument about women living through the conquest. One of the key ones is the diversity and the complexity of this process of conquest. It's not just Aztecs versus Spanish. There is a mosaic of different ethnicities involved, different agendas, things shaping what was going on. And there's a lot more than just this too. That's just a couple. We need to evaluate whether a particular game element contributes to our historical discourse. If it does, how can we maximize it? And do we need to do additional research? Now, one little case study that I'll quickly go through, I am being mindful of the time, is the level that we're currently making, which is the smoke prison. This is a really great example of how we've actually put this framework in practice, implemented it into our design. So in our current prototype that we're working on, Marina wakes up in a smoke prison created by the god Tezcatlipoca. She must find a way to escape the prison and escape the menacing and brutal conquistador Pedro de Alvarado. Now, Marina was not a fighter. She did not wield a sword, she did not wield a weapon, but we still wanted to give her a way to do something rather than just running. Just running didn't seem very Marina. She was quite a strong, a very capable, a very proactive person. And so violence couldn't be the answer. So instead we created this game mechanic, which we call Words of Power. That's just our internal name for it. So I'll just show you a little bit about how it works. This is footage from our current build that we're working on. It is a very, very early in progress build. So please, if you see things missing or things that are janky, the UI does not look fantastic right now, but it is in progress. We are going to continue to refine this. Basically, when the apparition of Pedro de Alvarado appears, Marina and her allies are trapped in this smoke prison, and they need to figure out a way to escape. Now, because this is a magical environment, Marina finds that certain words can actually trigger changes in the environment. Now, her ability in real life was to learn languages very quickly. She was an extremely gifted linguist. I'll just stop that there for a sec. So we decided to use a sort of word learning mechanic to show that it was her words that gave her power as a woman in this period. She had to survive by learning to communicate. So in this mechanic here, you have to figure out which words you need to learn in order to trigger a change in the environment. In this case, it's liberanos, which means freedom. And then she's able to escape. So that's one of the ways how we've managed to find a compromise between the needs of gameplay and the needs of what's historically authentic and meaningful for this character. Now, just a few quick words to conclude and bring it all together. What we're really hoping to achieve in this game is to give the player a chance to sort of play with history themselves or do their own historying by showing multiple perspectives, by allowing people to take the perspective of these sort of under-researched and underrepresented historical actors. They can compare accounts, evaluating cause, consequence, and choice, consider the role of human agency and structural causes that may have influenced people to behave the way that they did. And we're hoping that this can be an inherently decolonial practice as well. So we're spotlighting Indigenous female perspectives, other counter-hegemonic perspectives as well, and hoping that by privileging these voices and these perspectives, we can work some way towards decoloniality. And we're also working really hard on trying to find ways to interact in a decolonial way. So that is through different gameplay mechanics like the ones that we just showed, different ways of knowing, different ways of knowledge, and by giving players agency in their historying and not just sticking to the traditional colonial account of this period. And so we're hoping to then foster critical historical consciousness about this period and about some of these colonial myths that have persisted. Thank you so much for listening. I'll wrap it up there. Now, just another little bit of self-promo, sorry, but if you want to actually play that build that I just showed, we are sending it out on Friday, and it will be a more polished and more progressed version too. So I'm really excited to send that out. You also get deeper insights into the design process. I write this myself, and I try to showcase all of these inner workings of what's going on with the game. So just head to dreamofdarkness.com/sign-up if you would like to play the build and follow along with our progress. I'll end it there. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Tamika. That was a whirlwind and was very, very interesting. So I'd just like to remind our attendees that if you do have questions for Tamika, please pop them in the chat window. Feel free to pop them in now before you forget them, and we will pose those questions to the speakers at the end of today. And perhaps I forgot at the beginning to introduce my colleague Karen Barth, who is also on the line, and she's our academic support librarian here at the University Library, and she will be monitoring that chat window if you have any technical difficulties. And Karen, I'm wondering if you could just share that URL in that chat so that if people didn't get it while it was on the screen, that they can find that there. So thanks, Tamika. So next up we have Dr. Rhett Loban. Rhett is a lecturer in education at Macquarie University, and his research interests include culture, game-based learning, and virtual reality. He received his PhD in 2020 from the University of New South Wales in Sydney, and that was for a thesis that examined how players might learn about history through engaging with grand strategy video games. So I'm assuming he probably found Tamika's presentation quite interesting. His was focused particularly on the practice of modding. In 2019, he was awarded the CSIRO Indigenous Professional Career Achievement Award for his work on the Torres Strait virtual reality experience and vision for different ways of learning. He's very kindly given us, said that today he's going to explore 3 projects with us. So it will be an interesting exploration of his work today. And as I mentioned, if you have any questions, please pop them in the window and we'll post them to him at the end. Yeah, there you go, Rhett.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Rhett. And before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands in which I speak today, the Wongal clan of the Darug Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and future. And I'd also like to extend that respect to any other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. So today, my presentation will focus on history and culture in terms of game and mod design approaches. And I'll be very briefly examining 3 projects that I worked on. One's more focused on history, and that's the Indigenous People of Oceania mod for Europa Universalis 4. And the other 2 are more centered on culture and community, and that's the Torres Strait Virtual Reality project and the Good Bag mod for Beat Saber, which is a Chinese martial arts mod for that game. So I'll get started. So in the Indigenous People of Oceania mod was a mod for Europa Universalis 4. So Europa Universalis 4, it's what my thesis focused on, my PhD thesis. Essentially, it's a grand strategy game that engages players in a historical world of the early modern period. And basically, you take control of a nation and you have to manage kind of different functions in terms of like economy, diplomacy, trade, military affairs, and internal stability. But when I was looking at this game, and at the time that I was looking at the game, many Indigenous nations weren't really represented in the game, at least not in a playable sense. They were typically represented as kind of like a grey blank piece of land or slate, and it was represented through kind of a small population, which could be assimilated, engaged with trade, but really that's just a small economic boost, or and then you eventually take over the land, or you exterminate the population. So newer versions of the game do have Indigenous nations in the Pacific. However, they tend to be restricted by the game rules and the code that make it much harder for you to play them, as opposed to, say, European nations or kind of other nations throughout the world. So before I just very briefly talk about my mod, what's a mod? So modding, I kind of see it as customizing, tailoring, and remixing game objects. And this could be software or hardware. So it's kind of short for modification. So you're modding, and then the output is the mod itself. So this modding closely aligns with probably scripting, which is you're kind of working with an existing system and with existing components, and you're gluing things together or you're tinkering around with it. But there's already this kind of framework, this solid framework that you're working upon, right? And this would be opposed to programming, where you're kind of building something up from scratch. So yeah, modding kind of aligns with that sort of scripting. And in fact, most of the work that you would do if you were modding Europa Universalis 4 is in those scripts. And the kind of deeper level code tends to be less well understood and less accessible, at least in Europa Universalis 4. So Indigenous people of Oceania. So like I said, at the time, Indigenous people within the game were kind of depicted as kind of a grey blanket piece of land. It was kind of a non-depiction. So in this sense, I saw it kind of practically as a representation of Terra Nullius. And the intended gameplay for these areas is that playable nations would invade and take over the land and colonize the land. So for me, this kind of was a denial of the historical significance of Indigenous people, and even their existence in any kind of meaningful way within the game. So my mod was really just a small mod to insert a Torres Strait Islander nation and some other Indigenous nations within the Pacific, just to add some level of representation and playability there. I do have to say though, ultimately, I don't think the mod worked in creating new perspectives or new gameplay. So while I was able to kind of edit the scripts and add these add playable nations into the game, the underlying mechanics, so not the scripts, but the underlying code, the hard code that's there as the foundation, still meant I had to kind of conform to ideological understandings of the nation and the state within the game, which really emphasized European style empires. So in the mod I created, if I wanted to play and kind of expand and impact on the game in kind of a meaningful way, I'd still have to maybe create a Torres Strait Islander empire, expand within the Pacific, go into Asia, and then go into Europe if I wanted to all out win through conquest. So I suppose for this mod, in this sense, I've probably just created maybe a more interesting version of colonialism. So even if we insert Indigenous nations and they're playable in that way within the scripts, it's really only on a surface level. And you still have to kind of conform to kind of these deeper level mechanics, which determine the overall gameplay and how you engage with the game. So that was very briefly the mod that I worked on. So Torres Strait Virtual Reality, so that project, so with Torres Strait Virtual Reality, it was a cultural focused project, and we used virtual reality which was a cutting edge technology at the time. So it was wild, several years ago in technology. So I'm not sure if it's as cutting edge now, but we used it to communicate Torres Strait culture and knowledge. And the premise of the game is that you're collecting items for a tombstone opening, which you'll attend. So in Torres Strait Islander culture, about a year or more after somebody's died, or whenever the family can afford it, you have the end of a mourning period, and you unveil their tombstone. And there's things like singing, dancing, feasting, and typically there's a head person, and they kind of delegate different responsibilities. And in the game, it's your responsibility to go collect drum, mats, and spears, as well as turtle and dugong for the event that's going to happen on Thursday Island. So in this way, the premise of the game is that you're kind of fulfilling these protocols, that cultural protocols that you in the lead up to the event, I suppose. So the design approach that we took for Torres Strait Virtual Reality was a little bit of a take on a player-centered design. And player-centered designs focus on, or they center on the audience and players and their enjoyment of the game. This is an iterative process where you kind of go back and forth with kind of the players. And there's a high importance placed on their experiences and as them as stakeholders. So you've got these stakeholders and you're going back and forth, and that's kind of shaping the game design and the gameplay. So I had a little bit of a different take on this. So I had more of a culture and community-centered approach. So while we're still kind of doing the technical elements in terms of player-centered design, where you're going and you're getting this kind of feedback, we're also doing kind of cultural and community engagement. So in some Indigenous cultures, or at least in Torres Strait Islander culture, you kind of talk to different people when you're going through decision making, and then once you kind of talk to all these different people, you'll arrive at a consensus. And that could be a policy output, or it could be some other product. In this case, it happens to be with a game. So that's kind of the approaches that we're engaging these different ways that we're engaging people in the community and in culture, and that's working into the game design. So we're making sure that the game is culturally sound, and that's kind of feeding into the game design process. So there's that element there. So in this way, it's kind of a two-pronged approach, where we're kind of going out and we're engaging the community in a way that can kind of technically refine the game and refine the game in terms of gameplay, but we're also doing it to fulfill cultural protocols and kind of engage the community, I suppose. So there were kind of a couple of different ways that we were kind of trying to embed culture and community into the game in that way. So we had the involvement of an Indigenous familiar elder embedded in the team. He was contributing, providing advice. We engaged community when I was kind of showcasing the game. So I was volunteering at various summer and winter school programs at UNSW. It was a means to encourage kind of Indigenous adolescents to consider a career in STEM, but it was also an opportunity to kind of get feedback and get some of the students and the adolescents kind of play the game as well. We were showcasing the game in a few classes there as well. Some of them had Indigenous focuses or large Indigenous cohorts. So we're kind of getting feedback from the community in that way as well. And that feeds into the project. And then myself, I'm a Torres Strait Islander. So I'm kind of there getting all these different kind of inputs from the community. And I'm kind of reflecting and thinking about that in terms of my own experiences. And I'm kind of shaping the game kind of around those things when I'm comparing, contrasting, and reflecting on all those different things. And a big thing that kind of guided my project, and that how I kind of see culture as well, is through the Torres Strait cultural tree. So in the Torres Straits, some people see culture as a tree. So you have these, and it's a palm tree, coconut tree. So with this concept, you have kind of the deep roots, and that's representative of deep culture. So things like long-standing traditions, histories, practices, and customs. And this is mediated through the trunk, which I kind of see as the person. And you're taking these cultures and traditions, it's mediated through the person or the creator or designer. And then you have these new cultural outputs that occur. And these can be new takes on dance, different art forms. Mine's kind of a game, so it's a different take of culture within a game output. So that's how I kind of see culture, and that's how I kind of see my game developing, is that it's coming from these deep understandings and deep traditions that came before. It's mediated through myself, and it comes out as something a little bit different, but it's still fundamentally drawing from those, I would say, authentic cultural aspects, which come from the community itself, right? So that was kind of that project, and that was a very important concept for me as well. And the last project that I'll just briefly talk about is the Good Bag mod for Beat Saber. So in this project, it's kind of a Beat Saber level where the player has to perform kind of sword saber, wushu martial arts to the rhythm of contemporary wuxia influenced, which is Chinese martial arts fantasy music. And in this project, had a little bit of a different take in terms of community engagement, culture engagement. We drew upon two cultural expert practitioners, a martial arts grandmaster, wushu grandmaster, and a Chinese musician from the Chinese diaspora in Sydney, and they strongly influenced and shaped the mod as well. So Beat Saber, just very briefly, is kind of these, it's a VR game, and you're hitting these kind of boxes that are flying at you, and you're avoiding barriers as well. But they have these kind of directional, ways that you have to hit the boxes to successfully hit them. And when you're doing this, you're hitting these boxes and you're doing it to like a piece of music in the background, but it synchronizes with the way that you hit these boxes. So you're building up this sort of dance fighting gameplay when you're playing the game as well. And we thought that worked really well with performing martial arts. So we worked with the Grandmaster to capture his moves and replicate them inside Beat Saber. So the player would perform these martial arts moves inside the game. So the Grandmaster actually thought we could use this as a component of a wider martial arts training package. But there were some issues there because you were kind of restricted in the way that you could move and that you could hit the boxes. So you had these mono-directional ways that you could hit something as opposed to a typical multi-directional moves that would happen in martial arts. So say if you have to do a circular motion, that's something quite hard to achieve within the game, where it would have to be a mono-directional kind of way that you're hitting the box. So in this way, it might be more of a flick of a wrist as opposed to a circular motion. So in this way, we have these fluid and organic martial arts moves, but they don't always fit into the strict gaming structures of Beat Saber, I suppose. So we've kind of only done half of this, but in the way that we design the mod, we're kind of getting the expert input, and that's kind of shaping the game design. And then later we want to get the player input when we start testing with players and get their input in the design process as well. So in conclusion for this, I suppose, the central focus was on Chinese culture, and we chose to engage Chinese people from the community to strongly shape the project outcome. So this is a little bit different from Torres Strait virtual reality, where in Torres Strait virtual reality, we have a Indigenous elder who's cultural knowledge holder, and then we're going out to kind of the wider community through the quality assurance and play testing process, and we're kind of getting their feedback and their input in kind of those two ways. This one had a focus more on cultural experts that were professionals and that had specific skill sets to input into the project and shape it. And they were fundamental to the project as well, because it's a game where you're kind of moving around a lot. and you're doing it to the a rhythm that's kind of happening and a music that's happening in the background as well. So these experts provide the opportunity to introduce, I would say, deep expertise and cultural knowledge into highly digital and future-driven spaces, typically where they aren't represented. So, I mean, obviously in Europa Universalis, there's a non-representation there. So in this case, we're trying to bring kind of knowledge from those communities and make that kind of center focus in these projects in both Torres Strait virtual reality and in the good bag mods as well. So yeah, I suppose that's my presentation. So thank you.
That's great. Thanks so much, Rhett. I love that idea of taking a game that involves movement and music, and it's almost like a training environment if you can get it to work well, or at least a physical experience as well as an emotional or intellectual experience.
Yeah, well, you're hitting these things coming at you. So there's might be speed training that you can do involved in that as well. But they're obvious, like I said, there are limitations, so you can't do complex moves. But he sees it working within a wider sort of, assortment of training.
Yeah, sounds great. Would I invite Tamika to come back on screen, please? And we have a wealth of questions here in the window. Thank you very much. So thanks for your presentation, Rhett. We do have a bunch of great questions. Please feel free to keep entering them in the window, and I will pose the questions to our speakers. Tamika, you up first. I'm going to roll together a couple of the questions, actually.
Yeah, easy.
So let me just say, were there any other historians or academics working on the Dream of Darkness project? And in the same context, do you have any actual game designing or VR designing experience? And have you experienced any challenges in working in this space?
Cool. So firstly, at the moment, there are 2 historians who are officially part of the team, like permanent members, myself and a PhD candidate from Oxford called Javeria Abbasi, who is the Aztec Mesoamerican expert at the moment. But we have worked with a lot of different historians in the past as well. We've worked with some really awesome experts in Aztec history and Mesoamerican history. We've also consulted with people like Dr. Mary Miller, the lead researcher of the Getty Institute, the director of the Getty Institute. So where we don't have the resources to have people in-house, we do go externally where we can. We're also in regular contact with Matthew Restall, Carolyn Pennock, and some other lead historians in the field, and they're very generous with their time and answer a lot of questions for us too. I don't have any coding experience or development experience. My training is as a historian, so I'd really like to learn one day. But yeah, at the moment, it's just a really collaborative process where we say, hey, is this possible? And they might say yes, they might say no, they might say, oh, we need to change it this way. And we just, it's an iterative process. It's constantly being refined like that.
Yeah. And also, do you have a specific audience in mind for Dream of Darkness?
Yeah, so it's sort of changing constantly because we're in very early sort of startup stage at the moment. So we have been focusing on a first sort of beachhead audience of academics who are really interested in history and in historical games. We are sort of branching out into people who are really interested in Mesoamerican culture in general, maybe people who might read books about it, and people who obviously are really into that and also play games, and people who want to see a more detailed cultural representation in a video game. But it is being refined still in process.
I think you can see that in some of the things that you've shared, this sort of iterative nature of what it is.
Absolutely. A lot of what Rhett talked about in his presentation resonated with our own approach as well, especially the sort of community engagement aspect and that iterative process. It's all, it's essential.
Yeah. And just one more specifically for Tamika, and it was Terry's question here. We've noticed of all the possible different names, the game design has gone with Marina. Would you like to comment on that decision? And also the other part of her question was, is it just third person view or can you play first person view as well?
Great question. So quickly, just the second part, it is third person view. There's no first person. We really wanted to spotlight Marina's sort of intersectional embodiment as the girl or woman that she was. So that's really important for us. The name that we have chosen for her, it does change in the game. So it really depends on what point in the narrative that she is at. So when the current prototype takes place, she is already sort of fully enmeshed with Spanish. She has been christened Medina by them. We are focusing on, from her perspective, this sort of diverse group of people traveling with Cortez. So there's a Maya, there's a Texcocan, there's other Mexica who decided to join up with the Spanish for whatever reason. So there's a range of different ethnicities there. And you will see in our current build that another Indigenous character does refer to her as Malintzin, as she would have used her Indigenous name, whereas the Spanish characters will refer to her as Medina. So it just, we're trying to sort of make a bit of a character development statement with the name that we use at different points in the game.
Yeah, cool. Now, this is actually, I'm going to use this. I'm going to start with Tamika, but also put the same to Rhett as well. And it was about how you can ensure the games can be updated or adapt over time. So as you mentioned, Tamika, you're in the build stage with Dream of Darkness. Has the project got ongoing funding? I'm assuming it's a commercial project. And how do you ensure that the team staff have shared skills to make sure they update the game in the future? And Rhett, I might also put that to you because you've developed a few applications in that are specific, and is there sort of ongoing engagement, and is it entirely dependent on you? Is the question as well.
Rhett, would you like to go first?
Yeah, sure. So with Torres Strait Virtual Reality, we started off, I think, with one build, probably maybe in 2017. And once we were taking it out and we were getting feedback, and like I said, we're kind of going through that consultation process. I implemented kind of a next update for that. And after that, I didn't really work on it there because I kind of left the university, so I wasn't involved in that place as much. But I guess that's how I kind of went about it. I was getting support by the university, so it is a university project of UNSW. So that's how I was kind of going along. And I was integrating changes based on the feedback I was getting from the classes and from the summer and winter school and from the community and all these different places. So that's how I was kind of updating the game when I was going through with it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a great question, Emily. I'm just reading your full comment here. So no, we do not have funding at the moment. We are trying to get funding. So if anyone knows of any funding sources that would be keen to fund an Aztec themed game, please let me know. So that's our big challenge right now. Think of us as like an early startup stage. So it's just sort of self-funded at the moment by the founders. So hopefully we can get some funding, and then, sky's the limit for us. In terms of updating and adapting, again, we are in a really early stage at the moment. So hopefully that is a, bridge that we'll cross when we get to the point where we actually release something. So thank you for that.
Thanks. Rhett, do you know of any First Nations games or mods that you would recommend?
I do like the work by Elizabeth Lepence. I don't know if anyone's heard of her. She does different kinds of games over in the Americas. So I would kind of recommend her. She's also an academic. So I kind of like her approach to work, working on the games. There aren't that many for Australia. I think that's the only issue for that kind of our region. But there are definitely First Nation games kind of outside of Australia, I think. I heard Never Alone is another really great game. I've never played it myself, but I've heard I really like the process that they've gone through to develop the game. It's an Indigenous game dev studio, so I heard they're really great as well. Yeah.
Thank you. And also starting with you perhaps, but also for both of the speakers, how have you previously, or will you assess the outcomes of your games and what it is that you're trying to achieve with these games? And for instance, in Tamika's case, learning critical historical approaches.
For like, say, Torres Strait Virtual Reality or Good Bags or something like that?
Probably both. It sounds, you've already talked a little bit about that sort of iterative process of development with community engagement.
Yeah, so we didn't necessarily have a way to measure. So it depends on how you kind of use the games. Sometimes games themselves, you could set up in a way that you have mechanics that they can't necessarily pass one point without learning something. Do you know what I mean? So in that way, unless they somehow kind of circumvent the game, you could kind of ensure that they have to learn what they need to learn to pass an area. But sometimes you just implement it in a unit, not necessarily with a kind of specific thing that you want the game to achieve in that way. So, for example, I used it in, we used it in kind of an environmental policy unit at UNSW. And the way that the vision that they had for that was they wanted the students to learn about like kind of policies and treaties and laws in place that facilitated cultural practice. So within Torres Strait virtual reality, you, as a part of kind of your protocols and kind of your responsibility for the tombstone opening, you're going and collecting drums, mats, and spears. And that's from the Northern Islands. And if you go to the Northern Islands, there are like traders from Papua New Guinea there, and they trade, and you get the items from them, right? But that's a pre-colonial sort of practice that happened. And there are laws and policies in place to facilitate those cultural practices. And then if you go over to kind of, if you're looking for dugong and turtle that you need to get for the feast, you go do that. But there are laws and policies in place to facilitate those cultural practices for traditional hunting, right? So I guess it was used to complement kind of the outcomes that the lecturer had for that unit. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. The game wasn't specifically designed for that, but we were looking at different angles in ways that we could use the game to highlight, hey, there's this policy, but this is how it might happen in practice when we're kind of doing it and you're playing through the game. Mm-hmm. In our Beat Saber, we got an expert judge to look at the game and to make sure that what was happening in the game aligned with what he wanted to teach through it. Do you know what I mean? So that was the Grand Master, and he was looking at it and saying, he played the game, he says, yep, this works, and I feel like I could use it to teach this sort of martial arts moves and this kind of training that I want. And that's how we were kind of ensuring that the game was meeting those outcomes for that project, I suppose, because he's the expert in it. So, yeah. Yeah,
for sure. Tamika, did you have a response to that? Like, how will you know that you've achieved what you wanted to with this process?
Yeah, so it's at the moment with early stage, it's just a lot of rapid prototyping and testing with select members of our audience. So we will come up with an idea. We might do something like sketch out a storyboard. We've done that a few times, and then we'll present it to our community and sort of ask them a few questions like, what do you think of this? You know, what does this make you feel, or like what kind of content are you getting from this? So we'll just test it out with our audience like that until we have the full game sort of on the way. It's hard to think about how we'll test the end product, but at the moment it's very embedded into that process of development and creation.
Yeah, it's interesting because I mean you're trying to create a product that is for fun as well, so your gameplay testing can be, is it an enjoyable experience? Do you want to keep playing? But also, are you learning what we're hoping you're learning without being too didactic, I guess?
We definitely don't want it to be didactic. We're hoping that it's very organic and very natural. So we're hoping that just by nature of experiencing the story and playing through, I mean, to some extent, you can never control exactly what the player is going to get out of the game. And that can kind of be a cool thing because we kind of want to embrace the dynamism and the sort of audience agency in especially receiving Marina as our main character, or Melinsin, because she is received in very different ways depending on who you speak to, what community, and we don't want to invalidate sort of any particular way of viewing her. So that's why we're sort of inviting the player to experience the story from her perspective, but not trying to impose one authoritative account of who she was, in a sense.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, I mean, we've had a couple of questions in the chat about, how do you go about designing so that the players know what aspects of the game are more factual or versus fun, and also how do you prepare people? What kind of preparation have you done to support players in learning how to use the tools to play your games and that kind of thing? And so it's that balance you're striking between it being a enjoyable, fun experience and a learning experience, and did you have any comments on how you're thinking about that? I mean, either of you. So yeah, Rhett, you've obviously designed a couple of things that are for use in the quite specific learning experience.
Yeah, so I did some research with Europa Universalis, and we got comments from the game community forums, and we also did some play tests at the university. And something that we found is that it's very hard for these games to teach factual history, because when you kind of play a game, you make a decision, it instantaneously doesn't really become factual per se, but it can teach these kind of broader narratives and understandings. And I think Tamika talked about kind of storytelling and those sorts of things. So as long as there are these kind of large concepts that are kind of being communicated through the game, through gameplay, I think that's kind of the main thing. It's like you not necessarily, it's not necessarily important to know what happened on this day and these kind of factual things, but the larger story that happened in history is the most, I think that's the more important thing, and that's what people remember, and that can come out organically through the games that you play. Do you know what I mean? So I think that's kind of the thing, and they have to be fun. I tend to find that does anyone remember like kind of edutainment games like Maths Blaster and all of that? Yeah, they were kind of like, they weren't really fun. And the mechanics were kind of really clunkily designed, and you played them, but I don't think they have as much as a meaningful impact as a game that's fun. And then you think about the content and how that works in with the kind of fun mechanics and engaging mechanics. So I think that's kind of the most, that's probably it's more, there's a scale, it's tipped more in that direction, more so than getting everything exactly right in terms of the history and in factual kind of depictions.
Tamika, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I definitely concur with a lot of what Rhett just said. You know, it does have to be fun. We actually had a funny moment developing that Words of Power mechanic that I showed, where one of our other lead developers was like, oh, you know, I don't think this is very fun, but like, you know, I can see why, you know, academics will like it and it's important for them. We're like, no, it has to be fun. Like, we've got to make it fun. And so that's one example of how, you know, the scholarly side and the game dev side can get their wires crossed. You know, like one of the devs sort of thought that we were just making this to be like educational. We're like, no, like we want this to be fun, so it has to be engaging for the player. We're hoping that they almost learn by accident, like it's an informal learning, incidental learning sort of thing. And I definitely, with what Rhett was saying about, it's the historical narrative that they come away with that is the most important thing. Like, of course we want to get the details right, but going back to a bit of what I said in my presentation, it's we especially have very limited resources. So there's no way we can get every single detail right. And I know we're going to make mistakes. I'm sure there's going to be things that we have to leave out, or we might think, oh, we really don't know what this banner looked like, and we cannot spend a month researching it. We just don't have the resources. So we think, is this really super important to the historical discourse, the argument that we're conveying? Or like, if we leave out this element, or if we, you know, don't get it super authentic, is it going to damage the discourse that we're portraying? And that to me is the most important guiding principle of our game development.
Yeah, look, honestly, that framework of decision making sounded like a really sensible way of sort of striking that balance, but keeping yourself clear about what the objectives of what you're trying to do.
It's so easy to get distracted.
Yeah, for sure. Oh, I can imagine. But no, I'm going to wind it up there. We've had a couple of questions come through that we haven't had time to answer, and I apologise if they haven't had a chance to pose your question. We are running out of time. Before we go, I'd like to say thank you to both of our speakers for really interesting presentations today, and to Karen Bath, who's been helping us behind the scenes as well. Before we sign off, I just want to promote our next webinar, which will be on Wednesday, the 12th of October at 10 o'clock Adelaide time. And that one is going to bring together a couple of interesting projects that are using, say, digital technologies in preservation contexts. One being Aaron Humphrey from the University of Adelaide, who'll be speaking about a project to recover lost built heritage in Adelaide using 3D and immersive virtual reality environments. So buildings that were significant but are now gone, and how we can help people understand those spaces in those environments without just being something to look at. And the other being a group from the State Library of South Australia, who have recently added to their preservation collection a collection of 1980s digital art which is quite challenging to preserve. It was a period of time where floppy disks were king, and making sure those things are preserved and accessible for the future, both for entertainment, for preservation of our cultural heritage, and for research purposes, is a big challenge that many GLAM institutions are facing. So with that, I'll say my final thank yous and sign off. And I hope everybody has a wonderful day today. All right, thanks. See you.